Hello, my name is Wilker Pacheco and I'm going to talk to you today about the class and ID selector. We will start by review what ID selector are. The ID attribute is used to specify a unique identity for an HTML element. That is, if the value of the ID attribute is unique in the HTML document. There cannot be two ID with the same value. We can compare the ID selector with the identity document of a person. For example, with the number of the driver license that is the unique for each person. In identify, it is a unique being. The ID must be unique and descriptive. This is used in CSS and JavaScript to give the select element a unique style. The syntax of the ID in the HTML and CSS is done as follows. The ID must be added at the beginning of the tag within it. We write the ID attribute followed by the equal sign and then the name of the value of the ID in quotes. For example, if I would like to give a unique style to H1 tag, so I go to the start tag of H1 and write H1 ID equal quote inside the quote name. To invoke this ID in CSS, I must write the hashtag sign followed by the same or value the ID. Then I could be like this hashtag name. I open bracket and within the bracket are the style what you want to place and close the bracket. The ID identifier are case sensitive. For this reason, we must write them the same in both HTML and CSS because otherwise the style will be not applied. The ID are also used to create bookmarks within an extensive HTML. For example, in the part of the document with the option to the reader for the better understanding with the possibility of jumping to the certain place in the document immediately. For this, we place the ID with HTML syntax in the place where we want the reader to go and by means of the link tag, we place the ID CSS syntax in the part of the document that we want to correlate and show here. Also, the ID helps us in JavaScript to access a specific element with the getElementID method. Document get element by ID. My header is the name or the value that document. Class selector. Class selector can be applied to one or more HTML elements, and an HTML element can have more than one class. We could compare the class selector with the cinema ticket that are the global identifier since they are not unique. Class identifiers are used in CSS to style the group of elements. To write the class selector in the HTML, we write inside the start tag in this case example, in the H1 tag, we will do it like this: H1 class equal quote inside the quote apellido. And to refer to that class in CSS, we do it by writing dot apellido, open bracket, and within the bracket are the style. The class attribute can be used on any HTML element. The class, the name is the case sensitive equal the ID. In JavaScript, we can use the class selector to identify an element through the getElementByClassName method, like the example. Here we have an example for an HTML code, and we will see how the ID and class selector works. First, let's see the structure of the code, that is the HTML. And for reason, the practicability, the style are in the same HTML document, but we go to the HTML code. We have header with a title H1, and it has ID is called encabezado. If we go to the style, we see how it is identified with hashtag encabezado. It has certain style in it. Go to style, hashtag encabezado. Put the mouse, it represent element ID encabezado. ID encabezado. Inside the tag main, the main tag, there are text section. And each one has ID that makes them unique with the document. Section ID 1, section ID 2, section ID 3. If we go to the style, we see how each one is identified with hashtag. Go to the style, hashtag 1 represent element ID 1. Hashtag 2 represent element ID 2. Hashtag 3 represent element ID 3. In this value, if we place the cursor over the H, over the hashtag, and this tells me what it is represent in H value. We also see in the section titles and paragraph, and they are identified with a class, one for the title and another for the paragraph. We'll see the title H2, the tag H2 has class título. The tag P has class párrafo. Each one section is go to the style. This represent that título represent element class título, the title. That párrafo represent element class párrafo, the párrafo. This have a style, párrafo color white from font size 30 pixel. Here in section ID 1, title H2 has class título and ID C1. This ID is the marker identified in the last paragraph here. In the link tag with the CSS syntax, if we click there, it will take us to the H2 tag with the corresponding ID. Control, click. Here we go. We will tag as the H2 tags corresponding ID. In the document, not see because it's enough large for C. Is work. For example, the background, the hashtag 3 ID 3 is black. La bandera de Venezuela is yellow, blue, red. Change color red. Enter. Save. Refresh. Here we go. Okay. Conclusion. ID selector, they are unique, one ID per element, direct linking in JavaScript. Class selector, not unique, same class on the multiple element, multiple class in the same element. A class selector have ability to style multiple elements quickly. Thank you very much for your attention. This is a reference for your review.